between the Emancipation Proclamation and Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia, so much is going on. The African American community is finding their place in society. And at that same time, you have this influx of immigrants who don't know where they belong and are sometimes cooperative, and sometimes there's animosity. Have these two groups of people who are desperate. They're desperate to make it. They both finally have a chance at the American dream. It's going to take an act of God to bring that peace. Hi, my name is Danielle Romero. Thank you so much for being with me here on my channel, where we talk about American history, American identity, and family stories. Just starting a series called Italian Americans Beyond Black and White. And this is the second video of that series. I did a video explaining what the series is about. If you're interested, I'll leave a link below to the playlist that's going to house all these videos. To be honest, this particular video, this topic about the tensions and violence between African Americans and Italian Americans, I wasn't sure if I wanted to start with this video because there are so many stories that you've shared with me, that I've read, anecdotes, history of the Italian American community and the African American community living together, working together, supporting each other. And we're going to talk about those. But I actually recorded this video once already. I did the whole thing and I ended up scrapping it because I just wasn't happy with the way it came out. And I think what happened is I tried too hard to create like a linear narrative. I wanted there to be like a typical story, like a beginning, middle, ends. Like, this is why this happened and this is where we are. But the truth is, this history can't be packaged into a neat story like that. It's very complex. It's not a straight line. And we have to remember that history is as much about our interpretation and experience with it as it is the facts. Some of history is objective, but some of it not so much. And the people we're going to talk about in particular, this video, they live their lives day by day, not thinking so much that they were history. So I wanted to kind of talk about some of these different angles. Now, for this particular story, I wanted to go out of my way to not really worry about what other people would say about it. I'm going to bring on historians, I'm going to bring on professors, but I wanted to just bring the primary sources to you and wrestle with it together. So I'm not going to get everything right with this, but I think that's kind of the beauty of history. It should be a dialogue like this, not a monologue where it's just one person spewing what they believe are facts. I think this is about bringing together our knowledge, what we've been told by our families, what we've experienced, what we've read, and discussing it and piecing it together to create the bigger picture. So this video is going to feel different. And I believe that's a step in the right direction. So I would encourage you to watch this video in its entirety, because if you just watch the first few minutes and you hear about this over here, but then you're going to miss this other part over here, and you need all of these pieces to kind of paint the bigger picture. And I'm going to share something a little personal at the end, but I'm going to wait until we get to the very end so we can just talk about this first. If you haven't subscribed to my newsletter, go ahead and do that so we can stay connected. YouTube has been censoring some of my history videos, and I want to make sure we can stay connected and do that. So let's jump right in. The late 19th and early 20th century marked the beginning of a complex relationship between African Americans and Italian immigrants. And I say Italian immigrants, I'm talking Southern Italian. I'm also talking Sicilian. And sometimes those are used interchangeably. Should they? No, not really. But the primary sources, a lot of times they were all kind of just lumped in together. But there is a big distinction between Southern Italian and Sicilian immigrants, like my dad's side of the family, and Northern Italians. Part of this complex relationship was fueled by job competition. So as early as the 1880s, Italians and African Americans were competing for the same jobs. Now, in some places like the South, they were working side by side on plantations after the Emancipation Proclamation, and a lot of these freedmen were now working on a plantation getting paid, and there had been advertisements to people in Italy after the reunification of Italy. There was a lot of turmoil still, and Italy wanted to send over people to the United States and kind of lighten the load. So a lot of immigrants were coming over to take jobs that had been vacated by the Emancipation Proclamation. They were coming and doing this manual labor in the South. But the rivalry was not merely about jobs, but also identity and belonging in the burgeoning urban landscapes of America as well. So how did they navigate these relationships? Well, we're going to dive into the different way that this has played out around the country, and also the massive role of Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia, how it affected these relationships. Now, the press also played a significant role, as it always does, in deepening these tensions, using derogatory terms to describe Italian immigrants. Self described Black journalists, they were at odds with each other, actually talking about the Italian immigrants. And we're going to get to that. From the outset, the relationship, though, between the African Americans and the Italian immigrants was fraught with tension and skepticism. The Detroit Plain Dealer, which was an African American run newspaper, it articulated this sentiment clearly. It said, quote, "The Italian does not make a good American." It went further to suggest a future where the concern would not be the integration of African Americans, but rather the presence of Italians and other, quote, "undesirable foreigners" who were entering the United States in vast numbers. And this perspective was echoed in another paper, the Washington Colored American, which referred to Italian immigrants as Dagos, which is a big no-no slur, and organ grinders, highlighting the prevalent disdain for their presence and their occupation. Organ grinder was referring to kind of like the butcher shop aspect of the work. The Omaha Enterprise was particularly vocal about its grievances and criticized Sicilian newcomers for their business practices. And it lamented that Italians in Omaha were establishing fruit stands on the city streets, and they felt like the way they were selling fruit was almost like auction like, and they thought it was unfair competition to businesses that were paying rent and taxes, because the Sicilian immigrants would come in with these like fruit stands, and they just were kind of, it's almost like when food trucks come in front of restaurants, and there's like that tension there. There was a lot of frustration, and the presence of the fruit carts clogging the streets of Omaha, though, symbolized a deeper issue. There was a direct competition between African Americans and Italian and Sicilian immigrants for employment, especially in other sectors like the railroad, construction, and coal mining. The Harrisburg State Journal, which was an African American publication, Harrisburg is the capital of Pennsylvania, said this, quote, "For some time, a bad feeling has existed between these sons of Italy and Africa." And the root of this animosity was attributed to the, quote, "filth which these foreigners insisted upon surrounding themselves with," which was a reference to the belief that the Italian immigrants had just like a complete lack of hygiene compared to how the African Americans were doing things. Now, there was a notable clash between Italian immigrants and African Americans in Spring Valley, Illinois in 1895. And the Italian miners, who outnumbered their Black counterparts, sought to expel them from the community over what happened. So the situation was basically that some African Americans had supposedly robbed and fatally injured a Sicilian miner. And he was able to say it was those five guys that did it, and while right after it happened. And so the immigrants formed a mob and marched toward the African American district where a lot of those families were living. And they were taken by surprise, and it was just violent riot. And the mayor of Spring Valley, the man himself was an Italian, and they stood by as the mob just terrorized the Black community. And the properties were destroyed, people were assaulted. And this riot wasn't an isolated thing. This happened a lot over the country. And I think it was a symptom of the broader tension. It was not necessarily racial, but economic. Uh, they were both trying to grab the same slice of the pie. Have these two groups of people who are desperate. They're desperate to make it. They both finally have a chance at the American dream. The African American community, only had a couple decades really of being free and having the opportunity to grab that American dream. And then now you have this influx of all of these immigrants coming, and they're vying for the same thing you're vying for. And it's every man for himself. But not always, because there were instances where these communities worked in harmony. And I want to give those a full video. I think it deserves it, but I want to touch on it here. There were many neighborhoods where Sicilians and Italian immigrants and African Americans were living fully integrated. In particular, observers in Chicago neighborhoods close to the Hull House noted that, quote, "Some Negroes live harmoniously in the same tenements with the Sicilians. Their children play together, and some Negro children have learned Sicilian phrases so that they are able to deal with the Sicilian shopkeepers." And similarly, in southern Philadelphia, reports highlighted that Italians and Blacks, quote, "seem to live harmoniously in the same houses, the same blocks, and the same streets." So you can see here that the coexistence there is a coexistence. And there was an African American newspaper in Philadelphia that encouraged its readers to, quote, get acquainted with your Italian neighbors. And George Schuyler, who was sharing his experience working in construction alongside Italians and Irishmen in Syracuse, that's New York, in 1922, he said he found them, quote, good humored and cooperative, ready to share their wine or a sandwich with you. The African American press also occasionally covered stories of Black and Italian marriages and the mutual affection between Sicilian and Negro children. An illustrated tale in the Crisis magazine concluded with this, quote, of course, only Jewish and Italian girls would play on the team when the coach let in the three colored girls, reflecting on integration in sports. And there were instances where African Americans and Italians stood united against shared adversaries. And Pennsylvania, they stood, quote, side by side, refusing to yield against a school board's exclusionary policies. And in Baltimore, mutual respect led the African American community during an Italian strike, an Italian led strike in 1924. They said, like, don't go in during this strike and work. Like, we're in solidarity with the Italian American community here. Booker T. Washington talked on this. He said, quote, our boy must begin where the Italian immigrant begins. And he told the African American community to emulate the Sicilian immigrant. He saves, he works, and in time, he becomes a master in these great cities. Now, Samuel Scranton, who is an African American inventor who was also in Brooklyn, saw things very differently. He urged members of his community to learn from the immigrants. The Italian is a human being, he marveled, for he will work every day and every hour to extract honey from everything he touches. But beware, he will sting. And so there's this sense of there is this industriousness out of necessity that the Italian immigrant inherently knows, like, there is no place for him unless he creates this place. And so it's really interesting to see this dynamic where the African American community is not in agreement on how to react to these immigrants coming in. And I think the newspapers are it's incredible to see just the back and forth of how the Italian immigrants are talked about. I think the relationship between African Americans and Italians during the early 20th century could be termed bittersweet, because in some places there was a lot of bitterness, there was a lot of animosity and tension and violence, and I think fear that the other group was going to get the advantage. But then there were other places where they realized, hey, we're kind of on the same level here. Let's team up. Let's work together and bring together both of our communities for the betterment of everyone. But the 1930s was kind of a turning point here. I think I want to give a lot more time in another video talking about the incredible integration, especially in Louisiana, for Italian and Sicilian communities with African American communities. There was a lot of integration down there and a lot of cohesion between these communities. But in the 1930s, there was a growing empathy among African Americans for the Ethiopians who were fighting against Mussolini's invasion. Now, at the heart of a lot of these challenges was the rise of fascism in Italy under Mussolini. This conflict further tarnished the image of Italian Americans, especially given Italy's aggression towards Ethiopia, which was one of the few independent nations in Africa. The Italian American community is being judged by many in the African American community for what's happening over in Ethiopia with Mussolini. But the African American community was split on this. There was not an agreement about what to do. So these boycotts of Italian American run businesses, not just as an act of protest, but they saw it as a strategic step in self-reliance. And there was this correlation between spending money at Italian businesses and supporting Mussolini. And the Informer wrote, quote, the greed of Italy may seem a long way off. As a matter of fact, it is right here at our door. And that same day, there was more protests in Harlem, and a lot of Italian businesses were targeted. And a lot of them had marks on the sidewalk with chalk, and it said stuff like, Italians don't buy here. Basically, this is an Italian shop. Don't spend your money here. But not all African Americans were sure that these boycotts were practical. A woman named Mrs. N. Walton, she was from Houston, Texas, she wrote that Italian merchants dominated the stores of her neighborhood, and it would be expensive for her to take a streetcar to another section of the city every time she needed groceries. She wrote, quote, that Italians have made thousands upon thousands off our race, saying that like they're making a lot of money from them. But the reality was other stores in Houston didn't even want to have African American customers. So there's this tension of the African Americans want to stop shopping at these businesses that are being run by Italian and Sicilian immigrants because they're living together in close quarters in these communities. They've been kind of, working together, and they want to boycott. But it's like, to boycott creates a whole host of problems. One, they have to travel even further to get what they need now. They have to go outside their community because the Italians have been in these communities. And two, some of the other shopkeepers do not want to have these people come into their store. The Italians said we're okay with that. And so you have like a lot happening at once. The New York Amsterdam News, another quote said, had other misgivings about the boycott. According to this paper, it was wrong to hold Italians in America accountable for the activities of Mussolini, and it could wreak distress among Negroes. Other people who are saying, like, do not boycott Italian run stores, do not boycott Italian and Sicilian businesses. We need each other. We can advance our own interests by sticking together as a group. I think this period of history really reflects the challenges of navigating multiple identities and what that looks like. So, for instance, for Italian Americans, there's this desire to maybe support their ancestral homeland and its political leadership, although many Italians had fled Mussolini and had fled fascism. So, some Italian Americans do not support that. And there's just this assumption that they do just because they're Italian, but some do. And so there's this reality of, meanwhile, African Americans, a lot of them are supporting Ethiopia and they're opposing the fascist invasion that is happening. And they found themselves at odds with the Italian American community. And there's this complexity between ethnic loyalties and national loyalties and what that looks like in your own community. Now, the invasion of Ethiopia by Italy brought these internal conflicts into the public sphere, creating a rift between the African American community, who saw Ethiopia as a symbol of resistance and independence. And this moment really should have been an opportunity for solidarity, a chance to unite against the broader forces of imperialism and racism and fascism. But instead, what happened was a missed opportunity for mutual understanding and collaboration between these two groups. I think it's a good illustration on how external political events can exacerbate internal divisions and push communities apart just when they really need to be coming together. So, this is not a linear story. There are so many more directions that this could go. And I think my big takeaway from this is that we can't paint this with a broad brush. We have to look at this story by story. And I think it's sad because you can see that every time there's this attempt to maybe push from the communities to kind of like come together and unite, there's these outside forces working against that. There's the Great Depression, where there was already struggles for work and getting work, and this is overlaid over the Great Migration, where millions of African Americans and people of color were fleeing the South to go to these northern industrial cities, going to New York, going to Detroit, going to Chicago. And then on top of that, you have in the 1930s Mussolini invading Ethiopia. And it's like, it almost feels like these communities couldn't even get a chance to just interact with each other in a normal way. But it seems that there are examples of when that time was allowed to happen. It was the children who were making the strides, who were playing with each other, learning, picking up on language from each other. And I just was really struck by that video. I mean, this was just like almost a bird's eye view of kind of what was happening in the country over these 3 or 4 decades between the Emancipation Proclamation and Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia. So much is going on. The African American community is finding their place in society. And at that same time, you have this influx of immigrants who don't know where they belong and are sometimes cooperative, and sometimes there's animosity. And it's complex and it's convoluted. And especially when we talk about the experience in the South during Jim Crow, we're going to talk a little more about that. A lot of Southern Italians and Sicilians were not always seen as white. They were darker than what a Southerner, for the most part, would consider a white person. They were Catholic, not Protestant. And a lot of times in the South, they actually did work and live in these African American communities, and they did so happily. And so, to paint with this broad brush to say African Americans and Italians never got along, they were always at odds, would be incorrect, but it would also be incorrect to say that they were doing really well until this point. I really think we need to look at these stories on a more granular level. That's hard for us, at least for me. I like to just know the facts. Like, this is how it was during this time period, and I don't think we can paint this with a broad brush. This is a very unique dynamic, and I don't think it's gotten enough attention. I think part of the reason is because we can't come to a simple conclusion. It's not a simple history. And so I did say at the beginning I wanted to share something a little more personal. So if you stuck around for it, here we go. So, how do we fix this? Well, I think if I'm being totally honest, if I'm being completely honest, I don't think we are ever going to come to a place of um, total peace and love between these two communities or any communities, at least not the way things are right now. My perspective, not as a historian, not as someone who, is seeing my own family story connected to this history, but I'm also a Christian. And I was reading the book of Revelations. Revelations is the very last book of the Bible. It's a apocryphal book. It's talking about the end times. It speaks in very figurative language. It's kind of a crazy ride. The man who wrote the book was John. He was having a vision from God about these things. And he says that in chapter 22, an angel showed him the river of the water of life. He's talking about being in heaven. And he talks about this river going through, and that there's this tree. And he says that the tree is a tree of life with 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit each month. So there's a new crop every month from this tree. And the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. And actually, my pastor read this passage about 2 weeks ago in church. And thankfully, our church is one of those churches where they have the lights really low, because I could just feel like hot tears coming out of my eyes, because I think sometimes, I'll speak for myself. I think if I could just study this history enough, we could figure out what went wrong and we can change it going forward, or we can make the right apology, or we can do the right thing, or give the right kind of reparation, or give the right kind of this or that. And I think that those things are still important. And I think there still needs to be healing between the communities, and we need to both extend an olive branch to each other and accept when one's coming our way as well. But I don't think that we will ever have that unity on this side um, of the experience of life. And so, when I'm reading this, it's going to take an act of God to bring that peace between the nations, for the healing of the nations. Um, we need that. We need that healing, and I really don't believe it comes from ourselves. And so, that's how I look at it, where it's like there's this duality of, we need to study the stories, we should learn the stories, we should understand, and we should be better tomorrow at loving each other. But if you're thinking that we're going to get to this place, this utopian place in the future, I don't think it's going to happen on this side of heaven. I don't. And so, it's this tension. These stories make me sad. We needed to just kind of do a big survey and just look at the landscape. And now, after doing this bird's eye view, I want to zoom in now and start looking at more specific things. And some of those are really beautiful, and they shine so much brighter um, against the backdrop of some of this darkness. So, thank you for being here with me. And um, I love reading the comments, even for those who respectfully disagree, and even some who are a little more sassy. Um, I love the conversation, and I really value it. So thank you for being here. Sign up for my newsletter so we can stay connected, and stay around, because we're going to keep looking at the Italian American experience beyond Black and white. We'll talk soon.